So before we even start breaking anything down, I'd like to talk about this project a bit in terms of what was the original ask. We are basically looking at all the amenity spaces around this real estate property. It was known as the Ivy, and we wanted to highlight those amenities in terms of what the target audience of the building is to expect in terms of having fun with friends, cycling, easy access to the subway, and all the cool hip restaurants around, as well as like coffees and stuff like that. So their target audience was basically new home buyers as well as students, and they just want to highlight that this is a young hip community and basically sell that through this fast-paced commercial. When this project was brought to us, we knew that we wanted to have a whole diverse cast in terms of what we were looking to do. Basically, this was shot over 3 days, and we had 3 locations per day, and it was a whole 9 locations over the span of 3 days, and getting all the shots that we needed to get in terms of this commercial and this everything flowing nicely is absolutely insane. But with proper pre-production scheduling and everything like that, it was a breeze, and we had a lot of people on this to pull this off. And the main thing that I want to start off in terms of camera movement is getting consistent camera movement across your edit. Yes, we had a planned shot list as well as where these would necessarily sit in the edit. And then when it came down to actually editing like the DC cut of this, we kind of changed things around to see what would actually work. And when it comes to a montage commercial, you can't really necessarily plan everything, because when you get to the edit and you start messing with things around, you're like, oh, this fits here, because we're kind of telling multiple stories as they go on. So how do we push that around, and then how do we flow through these stories naturally without seeming too jumpy or anything like that? So when it comes to montage commercials, you have basically, in this case, multiple storylines going along, and you have to jump to them fluidly, and you have to do this through camera movements, match cuts, and matching the movement if you're pushing in, if you're pulling out, dollying across something, or even with the specialty shots that you see throughout the piece. So we're just going to go through the entire edit together, and I'll show you my thought process in terms of shooting this, camera movements, what we had pre-planned, as well as just me being the editor as well, what I had in my head when I'm shooting this. Obviously, in a lot of situations, you don't want to be the editor if you're a cinematographer or director of photography, but this is the reality when you're shooting these commercials and you're running a production company and everything like that. A lot of times in different projects hold that have multiple roles under just one blanket. As you progress, you'll move away from that, but there's some projects that just require it, and it makes it easier. So the first shot is the first shot we wanted to be higher energy, and we have blocking of our talent and then the camera movement kind of swooping in. It was me on a Segway with a gimbal, and this was all shot in the red Komodo and Vespid primes. And what we have here is our talent walking this way, and then the camera movement coming directly at her. So this is kind of an in-your-face shot to set the tone as well as what's going on here. So we were, in terms of the shooting day, I don't exactly remember when we shot this, but we planned it in terms of shooting this midday in a nicely shaded area where the sun wouldn't be too harsh on her face, as well exactly where she's standing right now. So above her are a bunch of trees and foliage, and the sun is high up in the sky. I'd say this was around like 2:00, and the sun direction is coming down. And then if we reverse back in the shot, that you can see that those hard shadows are right here, and then the sun direction matches that as well. So essentially I'm backlighting her, and this was super light because our crew was splitting up and setting up multiple other scenes as this was happening. So this was one of the things where it's like a skeleton crew and we're just shooting it to get it done. And yeah, when it comes to camera movement, I'm just pushing in and then tilting up, and this is giving that energy, and it's matching her energy as well in terms of like she's hailing down her Uber, and that's the whole point of the scene. When it comes to lighting and everything, again, this was natural. We didn't have a bouncer flag because I was woving in, and this was a wide to tight. So I could have had somebody walk with a bounce board to give a little more shape on the right side of her face, because this wall and everything behind her is acting like a giant neg. So this is just right timing and right time of day. If I shot this any later, the sun would be creeping around all the buildings and casting shade even more, and we wouldn't have these like checkerboard that I'm looking for in terms of light and dark parts of the image. Because like here on the sidewalk, we got a nice slash of light on this sidewalk back there. On the trees, you can see the shadow as well on the trees. On the trees here in the back, you have a nice slash of light, and then even the pockets here, and then it's just a mismatch of color, and then just basically that checkerboard we're looking across our image. Now, as you can see in the beginning of the edit, we are introducing our main characters. So there's kind of 3 lives that we're playing out. We have the woman who is basically treating herself to a nice day, a self-care day. We have a student who is, taking the morning off and then going to hang out with his friends. And then we have another young gentleman who is basically going into the subway and then meeting up with his girlfriend and then going shopping for the evening at the grocery store. And so as we introduce all these characters, we are constantly pushing forward as they are pushing towards us. So this is how you introduce camera movement. This is how you introduce energy into your edit. And when it comes to this scene specifically, we were playing on basically making this look commercial, but using the natural resources we have in play. So again, this was the early morning, so we have like a nice daylight streaks coming through here. But I wanted to emphasize that even more. So the way you do that is adding your own lights and matching that color temperature. So I wanted to seem like that we had lots of sunlight blasting into this spot exactly. So I have an aperture 600D outside the window on camera right there, and that's blasting through this. And this is giving me all my kind of light streaks, and this is the material reflecting it. Obviously not the best. You could have matted that down. Depends on what you like, but I like these like little highlights and everything that paint across my image. And that is just coming from the 600D. So it's taking my natural light that I have there and emphasizing it and making it look, across the whole image and not necessarily any moody. When it comes to commercials like this, you want to be kind of more aggressive with your lighting in terms of that stuff as well. Unfortunately, we had these little panels up here in terms of like this ugly roof and everything like that. That's what we just had to work with the location. Obviously, you could swap to a tighter focal length, but these cuts are so fast that you not necessarily have to look at that side of things. So that's just something that we had to work with, and then we played it up. But then in the top here, one of the lights was out, so I added a Titan tube. As you can see, there was no reflection there, and then I added a skirt to it. So this is just giving me some ambience and some levels on this part of the wall. And then we color matched this to this. So it was around 3000 Kelvin. This is like a tungsten source. And then for our key light, we have an aperture f22. This is one of my favorite lights to use because it's so versatile. And it just gives me that little kiss of light I'm looking for when I am lighting things like this, like commercials. So this is on his right side, so camera right, and this is set at 3200 Kelvin because I'm matching the sources inside. So you could match this to 5600 Kelvin because like it's from the daylight, but I'm like, okay, we're moving into this space, so I want him to be lit from daylight and then lit from the inside, which is like this tungsten feel and warm feel that we have here. And then to add some contrast back into the image, I needed to basically black out this whole side because this is my shadow side. You always want to be shooting on shadow side when it comes to getting the most interest on your subject as well as your environment too. So I had 2 4x8 floppies set up here, and these are skirted down. So it's kind of like wrapping behind the camera. And then this is just giving me all the shadow and more dark side of the image on the left. And then sometimes a little bit in his face as he walks here. Later on in the edit, you can see that he flips it up, and then that's more of a close-up shot where we walked everything in. But this was kind of the hardest thing I find when shooting any commercials or anything like this, when you have a multi-shot sequence in terms of lighting, getting your wide, getting your medium or tight. When you're getting coverage, is lighting the wide is always the hardest because there's so many other things that you have to deal with in terms of lights spilling everywhere, and then the fact that you can't walk your lights in. So always start with my wides whenever I'm shooting anything, and then that's pretty much it for this. And this scene here, this is pretty public, so we didn't have a lot of time. It's one of those things where you shoot and then get out of there. So we max maybe had 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to shoot this. And again, this is just matching the same relative camera movements where I'm doing, so where I'm kind of like pushing in, sweeping up, and focusing on what they're doing, and they're walking either into frame or out of frame. As you notice, our talent in the beginning was walking right to left, and now this person's right to left, and then he is left to right. This isn't a big issue, but if you wanted to be super consistent, you could just flip your image, and then you would just see these little words in reverse or anything like that. But again, we felt that this felt good, and then also considering what the next shot necessarily was. So again, this is something just to consider in the edit. These are little things in terms of making a camera movement flow throughout the edit. So like I said, we kind of shot this for every scene and scenario. But when we go and talk about something lighting this and shooting it, what direction we should shoot in, I always look at where my light sources are in a natural space like that, where I can't control, and where I have something that could be a natural negative fill. So something that is basically absorbing light and not necessarily bouncing it back in, or nothing there at all. So in this case, as you can see, kind of we have some interest with some lights here, and this is acting as my key. And we have another light here acting as my key. And then this LCD screen is also casting some light, which is super ugly. So obviously we got some shine. It was a super hot day, but this is acting as my light side. And then if we swap colors over here, this big pillar is acting as my negative fill. And also, like, even on a shirt there from this turnstile is casting some shadow on here, and basically absorbing the light, bouncing a little bit back, but obviously not as much as we have on the other side. So this is just providing some shadow and some shape. The contrast levels here are super low. This is usually what commercials look like, but just something to consider when you're shooting in a location where you can't really control anything, but you want to keep it consistent. Going into the next shot where we're completing what the first person we're looking at was doing. If we look at the other shots in the edit, he's back in the subway, and then he just found the record that he was looking for, right? Obviously, it's not in, like, we're not going to be doing female talent and then the younger male talent and then the other male talent. It's as like sequence. We're going to chop it up and kind of see what feels better. And this is when camera movements and what makes sense in the edit looks better and feels better. You can plan it in terms of like saying, I'm going to do it how I scripted it, but when you get to the edit, everything just changes. So this is something that we found works as well. So we go into her movement, which is her closing the door, and the camera is attached to the door. So I used the Tilta Hydra kit plus like a tripod extended mount. This is great for just attaching things to cars, but you could use a hostess tray or any other rigs, and then you could just use a simple DSLR. For a lot of these specialty shots, for this one specifically, we used the Red Komodo, but for a lot of them, we actually rigged up the FX3, which is an amazing camera for this stuff. When it's a split second, because it gives you a lot of color information for the size of the camera, and you don't need any accessories unless you want to see the video, obviously, but you can use the app. But it's so easy to attach to things, and it's so lightweight. So there's not much to talk about here. She's swinging the door shut, and that's our specialty camera moves that we start to introduce. And it is a little bit dark here, so we opened up the sunroof. But again, this is the same scene, and our sun is technically behind us and is shooting down into here. So it's technically all lighting the background and a little bit of him through the front window, but she's super dark. If I had time, I would have set a light up on the outside and shot it through here, maybe with some diffusion to light up some of her side of her face, as well as just add an ambience to the car itself. But we were moving so fast, and this is one of the shots that the movement played a lot more in this necessarily than what the image looked like, because we were mainly looking at the story and what is going to drive that, and not necessarily being nitpicky in terms of like, okay, can we take 15 minutes to light this? Because realistically, we didn't have the time. So it depends. Sometimes lighting a scene is better, but sometimes prioritizing camera movement. And this is just a kind of judgment call that you have to make when creating these things like this. Then we go into the next one. Again, this is just considering the lighting and everything in the space that we have. I am now looking at where my movements are in terms of what is going to be moving in frame, where am I going to be moving, and then how can I make this the most interesting. And I love the way that this looks in terms of all the leading lines that we have. So leading lines just are lines that lead your attention to exactly what you're supposed to be looking at. So all these lines direct us to our main talent here. Sorry, these arrows aren't the best. And then we have a nice line up here that does the exact same thing. And then we actually build a frame of us to look at our talent specifically. So when it comes to, again, we're making locations work. If we look at the lighting, again, this is going to be backlighting. So I'm developing a shadow automatically with these lights as I'm on the shadow side of him. So this is just going to give me the most interest when working with a space that you don't have control of. And when another tip that I like to look at is look at your composition in terms of how can I make this the most interesting so the lighting doesn't take over. We knew we had a good colorist on this, so he could dial back a lot of the lights and everything like that. So I mainly focused on, okay, how can I make this the best looking image in terms of a composition? And that's just something to consider when you're shooting in locations that you have no control over any lighting. And then now we get into the match cuts that really drive this edit forward. We just introduce all the characters and what they're going to be doing. So we're in this record store. And then in each of these locations, we did this overhead dolly shot going across each movement. And we wanted to drive the edit forward. And generally speaking, when you're going forward in reading or anything like that, you're going from left to right. So this was a big thing that we wanted to implore in this edit, as well as all these camera movements. And it just helps it sell even more. So again, our general movement is going from left to right. And then this was shot on a 35 millimeter. And when you're doing things like this and you want to keep it consistent, you want to shoot on the same focal length. You want to have the same speed going across, and you also want to have the same distance. So we knew exactly what we were focusing on, which was here, the ivy and the record itself. In this scene, we're focusing on the nails, and in this scene, we're focusing on the coffee and then the table. So we kind of took this as a reference service, and the first thing that we shot in terms of how the days went was this. And we are like, okay, this feels good. We have some room for cropping and everything like that. Let's make this the distance that we had. So we had to measure. So I had my key grip measure this, and then he would basically, every time we had to set this up, he would make sure the camera was at that exact distance as well. You just don't want to set up the shot and then, okay, everything's ready and go for it. You have to think about these things in terms of how it's going to look in the edit. Because if one was, out of whack, even by an inch or two, it might really play up on that. So we wanted to make everything consistent from the camera movement, position, and even lighting when it comes to these things as well. So when it comes to flat lace stuff like this, lighting it can be very subjective in terms of how you want to do it. Before in the shot that we knew that we had a bunch of sunlight coming from here. So that's what I want to motivate it by. So this was simply setting up the F22 on this side here. And this was double diffuse like we like it. And this is a little bit more bluey. And this was us again set to 3200 Kelvin. We didn't really play with color temperature differences as we're going along shooting these scenes. We wanted to keep it consistent. And then on the other side, I just have a neg sitting up here. And then this is just sitting on the side, and this is kind of giving some contrast back into the image. So super simple, just one light. And we wanted to really highlight this without putting any really hard shadows on this. And then you can see we have some shadows over here and everything like that. So not much really to this. It's just one light and the floppy as well. And plus whatever ambient tone we had in the room from the lights that we had previously. And then again, going across here, we have the same camera movement going from left to right. And then you can see that our key side is on this left side here. In a bunch of these places, we're going to get over another thing that we did was a bunch of probe shots as well. And that's when lighting gets really annoying because the probe we were using was at f14. But for this specifically, we use the f22 again. This is, again, a great light to use. And then we had this set to daylight because this scene was a little bit more bright and airy, and we're playing up on the daylight look. And then this is just pointed this way. And then on the other side, we didn't really have any neg. And then in here, we have a little MC, and it was set to a violet color, or dark blue. And this was like pointed up and bouncing around in here and just giving us a nice little interest here. Obviously, it doesn't make sense because this is what you cure the nails with. That's what everybody was telling us on set. But as a cinematographer and director, we kind of had the final say in terms of how this looks. And we're like, yeah, we want a little more interest. This is going to be like half a second shot. So this is one of the decisions that we made. And then on the other side here, we again just have a floppy. I believe we had 2 of them set up. And this was just to add some contrast back into this side of the image. Right? And back on her arm. So pretty simple. And then to add more levels into the room, there was a 1200D in the mix at like 0.1%. I'm going to get into that later because that was for the probe shot. So that will make more sense as we go on through this edit. And then this is the next shot in the sequence where he's grabbing the coffee and then it's matched with a movement. So this is a decision that you have to make in terms of, okay, I feel like this is a good spot, to continue the storyline of this character we have. A lot of these things that we're looking at before are one shots of each character, and then we don't necessarily have a 2-shot yet. So this is my 2-shot. So we go into the specialty shot, and now how do we transition out of this specialty shot? Match that another shot in the scene where he's moving onto the table, and then we see what's over there and reveals that he was on his way to travel to a date, right? So in this specifically here, again, shooting overhead, and then this is a flat lay, so we have a lot of interest and stuff that we can work on. And again, then I'm going to repeat myself, but we had a F22 here. And this was kind of more table-y, like a 45-degree shooting down, not giving us a lot of hard shadows. We wanted to make it feel bright and airy. We wanted to make it feel bright and airy, and as you saw in the next scene, there's a huge window we're playing with. So that window was in play in terms of adding ambient to the room. And then in the corner of the room behind him, I can't necessarily draw it, but if this is the room we're looking at, and here is the counter we're going across, and he is walking over here, in this corner here, we had an aperture nova, and this was just pointed straight up into the ceiling, adding more levels to the room, adding to the ambience that we're getting from the daylight. And then we didn't have any floppies or anything set up here because on the side of the counter, there was this like box that had a bunch of things in it in terms of pastries and everything. And then this was kind of sandwiched in between 2 things. So this was providing enough contrast on our image that I was pleased with in terms of matching it to the other shots that we have. So a little bit there and a little bit there. So there's not necessarily a shadow or light side, but I look at this and I'm like, okay, the contrast levels are not high, obviously, between the lightest part and the darkest part, but I have some interest in terms of the color palette as well as, what is light and dark. And there is some shape to it here. And now we're introducing a new camera movement that we haven't necessarily seen before. But as you can notice here that we are tracking the cups. And then into the next scene, we are still tracking the cups, but in another camera movement form. In terms of this, I'm panning left to right as well as tracking with it. And then in the other ones, we were just dolling across, still tracking it from left to right. So this is just something to consider for camera movements and things that you want to incorporate is track objects. But if you want to make it seem like a different shot, track it in the center frame, but have a different camera movement. And this will even sell it even better because this just flows so nicely from shot to shot. And for this one shot specifically here, the big problem that we were facing is shooting into this obviously big window with this gentleman sitting in the back there. So where do you place your lights in terms of making this feel real and feel consistent? As you can see that we have a lot of light spilling here, but it was like a weird day. It would be rainy one time and then dark, cloudy the other. So we're dealing with overcast and really a dark sky. So behind here, actually, and this will make more sense as we look over. We actually have an aperture 600. We actually have an aperture 600D, and that is just cleverly hidden behind that post, and then that is shining through the window here, which is painting all the light that you see on this side here. Oh, it's painting all the light that you see on this side here. So I'm just going to redraw that aperture light here. It's painting all that light on the board here, as well as this and the seat here, and then also just giving us a nice key light on our subject here, which we're swapping our focus to. We're going from the cups to her. And then to add more contrast back into the image, we had a floppy set up here, and it was kind of tabled over, and I kind of maneuver myself over it. But it is adding contrast back specifically into her face, as well as the rest of the image too. So it's taking the natural light source that we had there, which was the window which we're shooting into to establish our light and shadow side, and obviously staying on our shadow side. And it gave us that nice contrast. But then I realized, I'm like, this is a little dark in terms of landing on her. So we added that 600D just to kick her out a little bit and add some splashes of light and dark throughout our image as well. Now, if we're looking, the movement between the next scene is that we have, bang, our next talent sitting right there and basically representing her seat. And now we're introducing a new camera movement, which is pushing in. So already you can see there's something that we're matching across the board from shot to shot. It's either talent position, what we're focused on in certain aspects, which was the cup last time, and then or camera movements. So you always want to have some sort of consistency across your movements. You can't just do a camera movement into a camera movement into another camera movement, because it will be jarring. So there has to be something that matches. And in this case, it's our talent that we're looking at here. Right. And then this is like kind of the same scenario when we have the lighting I was talking about earlier. And then looking at light specifically in this image, we have a lot of nice strip lights that we kind of really lucked out on in terms of a great location that just paint a lot of light pockets that you look for in commercials as well. But so we just had to amplify this and add to it. So to add more ambience to the room, I don't remember if it was a Nova or a 600D, but we had a light. I'll just say it's the Nova, just shooting right up into the ceiling. And this was set at 5600 Kelvin. And then we have an F22 acting as my key light here. And this is again set to 56. And another thing we had, and this is going to seem very weird, is we had a 6x4 scrim gym, as well as it was a 4x4 scrim gym as well. So this was adding like one layer of diffusion. So I'll just say +1. And then we had another one, which is a like 2-stop of diffusion. So it had it on both sides. So this is like triple diffuse. And then we had a 1200D shooting through here at like a very low percentage. And then you can see the difference in quality of light when looking at let me just write a 1200D. Right. And then this is my F22. Right. And then my Nova back here, just to, clarify things. But you can see the quality of light as well as softness of the light. We only had the 1200D set at 1%. And the reason we had that was a shot that we did previously at the top of the day, which was the probe shots, which we were going to get into later. And you just need so much light for that. And using harsh light sources like the 1200D that has so much power, you need to diffuse it so much to get something that I like in terms of a soft look. So if you look at the light quality on her shoulders as well as her arm here, and even her hands, you can see that it's super soft, super diffused. But then if you look over here with this, it's a little harsher. Even though the Amaran has 2 stops of diffusion on it, it could be even more with the triple. So you could see the difference in quality of light. And this was just in terms of how we're moving. If I had time, I would have set up a cutter or something to diffuse it even more. But again, this was just a quick shot that we had to get, and we were still happy with it. And then to add some contrast back into the image, again, just same concept of adding floppies to this side of the room or the camera side of the room to add that contrast back into her. So she has that nice Rembrandt lighting that we're looking for, and then a nice gradient going across her full body as well as her face. And then we get some shadow here, shadow throughout here, and then even on her hands and the person doing her nails hands. And then we got some highlight from our key sources here too. So again, very light, dark parts of the image and how we can complement that and make everything pop and kind of look 3D. And that's what you do when creating any depth in any image. If you're just looking at lights and darks or even color, and then even obviously separating your talent. So now as we move from this shot to the next, we can start playing out these actions, and because we've already got kind of an introduction to each of the characters. So now we can start doing some two shots and really dialing into the stories and what we're supposed to be looking at here in terms of what we're telling about these amenities and everything like that. So this is, again, just the previous setup. This is just with a 20 mil lens. And this is, again, you can see that little MC that I was talking about here before. Let me get my pen here. And this is the little MC that I was talking about before, giving that blue violet-ish light. And then you can see that we're on our key side here. And then we got some shadow on the left side. So again, I don't exactly remember what setup this was, but it was a quick shot right after we got the other shot. So I'm assuming it was just right after and this was just using the same lights that we had before set up. It was convenient. Everything's already lit. We just had to angle the camera down. You can see our first AD's feet actually right here. So that's just something funny as well. But yeah, super quick shot that you don't even notice that. And now the next movement that we're looking at, so this is considered a POV shot of obviously her. We go into a POV shot of the bike. So again, you could do a POV shot of him, but we were like, that's not really cool or anything like that. Hands are changing. This is just like a POV shot that's cool and looks good as well. So if we talk about how this was done, we had our key grip who rigged it to the side, front of the bicycle, and then we're using a 12 mil lens with a little matte box on it. So we had to strip the camera down. It was an FX3. So this is what I talk about in terms of rigging things. Super simple camera to rig and very convenient as well in terms of what you have to put on it. And then again, this is just a time of day thing in terms of shooting. Our sun was here. Our sun was actually behind our talent. So it's like way up in the sky over here. I know this is looking on the side, but you can see like that's where the sun is beaming down, not necessarily on his face. So super high sun, something that we couldn't avoid. Obviously, I would love to shoot this like early morning or something like that, where you have less harsh shadows. But again, in terms of telling him where to necessarily to bike, I was looking in terms of how can we create interest in terms of getting shadows on his face that aren't as so bad. So this is backlighting him. So I had him go up the street, and we're like, that's too harsh. So then we had him come down the street and kind of go through these shaded areas that have like these visual interest all over the street as well. So another thing to consider when looking at, planning your movements and when to shoot them in terms of times of day and everything like that. And mainly just looking at how to position your talent and what to do in those scenarios as well. And the next shot that we go into is another POV shot. So this is just matching those perspectives and then interest that we're looking for. And then to even match this even further is to add camera whips and just things like that. This is a lot of Tenfold style, is to have these fast, blurry camera movements that you don't necessarily know what it is. In this case, this is just me whipping the camera around in a tree. And then this matches very well because like you see this green in the background and all over the image, and then you get a whip of green and we're like, oh, we're another place on the bike. And then again, this is going down the same this is going down the same street, and it is in the same direction that we're going through first beforehand, because the sun is way up high and is shooting down this way. All right, so it's giving us that same shininess on the left side, and then we're on the shadow side, and it's just giving us basically a lot of visual interest in terms of what we're looking at, in terms of our shadows, shapes, and everything in between, in terms of getting a nice looking image when the sun is this harsh. This is the big main scene that I want to talk about in terms of camera movement, and then we're going to basically look at each of these scenes and break it down in terms of how we lit it, and also just how you deal with spaces in terms of natural lighting and playing with that as well. So again, in this sequence here, we've already introduced each character, and then we kind of done a 2-shot of each character. And now we're going to go into another montage sequence of like the actions that we did. So in this scene here, this is actually a 3-shot. So we go from a POV to him, we get a camera whip, then we get a POV of his feet, and then we get an outside, necessarily like wide. I just noticed somebody sitting in the background of that image. Well, that's great. And then this is going from left to right. Obviously, when we're driving a narrative forward, we want to be going from left to right because that's the natural way we read things as well. And then so left to right, and then we're going through elements in the foreground. And honestly, when we were planning this out and location scouting and everything like that, we knew that we wanted elements in the foreground and we're going to be moving across these scenes. We didn't know exactly how they would stitch together in post, but a thing that we wanted to get consistent is the distance between us and our talent, the speed of the camera, and then how we can transition that into another scene afterwards. Are we stopping? Are we slowing down? Or are we going to continue moving and everything like that? So we kind of shot each of these scenes consistently across the board so we'd have that flexibility in post. So the full shot plays out like me full on tracking him, and then I stop. And then this one plays out in terms of now we see the grocery, and it's just blended with simple keyframing and masking is in Premiere Pro. There's nothing really advanced here. And then we reveal our 2 talent that we introduced before that are going grocery shopping. So this is highlighting the grocery spaces in the amenities near the building as well. So then this is going across the frame, and then a nice easy transition point is that we have a shelf going into a bookshelf, and then we land on the exact perfect book that she was looking for. So again, this is one of those classic, like you see these in a lot of commercials in terms of montage stuff, in terms of going across multiple scenes. And this is how we pull a viewer into this unrealistic world that we're creating, right? Is doing these cuts like that. We're like, whoa, I didn't expect that. And also adding sound of dying and everything like that. So we go kind of from like a uncontrolled environment where we're just dealing with the daylight, and then to a sub-control environment where we had a lot of strip lights that we had to deal with, and then into a full-on bookstore that we had control of all the lights and everything like that. So I tried to keep the lighting consistent so we weren't looking at anything too crazy, but this one was just time of day. We're shooting it during all those bike scenes, so the sun was up. This was around 1, 2 o'clock, so high sun. You want to avoid shooting on this. But we were dealing with like a lot of shadows and a lot of interest and everything like that you can see on the floor. And this just shooting on the shadow side just allows that all that interest that we're looking for. So again, we got some highlights on his arms, his legs, the bike itself on the back side. And then if we look at the shadow that we're creating here from, you can see the sun position right there. And then the shadow side that we have established. And he's just going through so many things where the shadows and light play in so many directions and everything like that. But it was super important to get this foreground element so that we can actually transition. And then to shoot this properly, we were dealing with multiple focal lengths because there were multiple distances that we had to do this. In this case, I was maybe 20 feet from our talent, so I was maybe on a 50. And then when we go into the next scene, let me just swap to my eraser here. And then in the next scene, I was shooting this on like a 35, but also when we were shooting this, we shot this on multiple focal lengths because we didn't know necessarily if we would have all these things in play in terms of having a consistency with the distance, right? So this is just something that you want to consider and get coverage. You don't want to just bank on shooting on one focal length. So when we shot this as well, we shot this on a 35, and then we had the ability to crop in post, but we just saw that it was too busy and didn't necessarily match what we were looking for. And then we swap into the 35 here. And then if we just look naturally, we kind of lucked out with this location in terms of having lights and strip lights there. So there was a bunch of rows of lights at the top of the ceiling, as you can imagine, like going across all this direction as well as this direction as well. And then we had a row of strip lights here. And then at the location, we asked the manager, like, hey, can we turn some of these off? And it was a situation of all or nothing, which is like a gaffer's worst nightmare. So what I had him do is diffuse this side by just putting little white pieces of paper up there. and then that diffused it and cut it down and just gave us a nice key light. And then they diffused the ones back here with those white sheets of paper as well. And then on these ones here, they blacked them completely out. So if I had a row here, they would be blacked completely out, as well as turned away to get some light back onto here, but away from our talent. And then if you just look at in terms of those highlights and shadows here, you can see that on our talent as well. And then if we look at the shadow side here, we have that nice contrast even in the face. And then this bookshelf here, and this shelf of this dark wood is just providing that natural neg, and even on here. So we're mainly getting the sandwich of light and the main key from up here, and then it's coming down, and then they're getting kind of sandwiched by the negative fill. So this is just something that you have to be quick on your feet in terms of looking at a location, and a location scout would help this a lot more in terms of deciding, how we're exactly going to light this, because we didn't have time to rig up tubes on the top. And we only had I think 2 to 4 hours in this grocery store. I don't exactly remember. And we had to get so many shots, including a probe shot here. So there were just so many things that we had to consider, and just quick shots that necessarily look good in terms of composition and framing, and not necessarily focus on the lighting. It's a grocery store. It's not going to be like super cinematic in terms of having like super contrasty or something like that. So again, we wanted to make it feel lit. It's a commercial, bright and airy. And then we go into the next scene where we are on the bookshelf, and then we had a lot more control in this area. So this is shooting a frame within a frame, and we're kind of doing that here as well. This is why this lines up so nicely going into our next shot, because it's kind of a matching shot in terms of we're focusing right on the center while tracking their movement. And then again, that frame and frame that we're looking for. So here we're kind of we had to do a top light source. So in this entire bookshelf, in this entire row of bookcases, we have Astaire Titan tubes, and these are set. Oh, that is a bad Titan tube. Set all to 2700 Kelvin, and they're all shooting downwards like this. And then we had crates on these as well. So I'll just draw a little thing like that. And what these crates did is avoid all the spill going on everywhere and just lit down into the center. And then you can see that kind of with the harsh highlights that we have on the top of her head. And this is very top lit, as you can see. I would love to add a little light back into here, but if we were going into the next scene, in terms of consistency, the shadow is right there, and then we're kind of more necessarily on a light side here. But we'll get into that after. So if we go back into here, you can see that here. And then this little catch light is from there's a big window in the front of the shop, and then this is spilling daylight all over onto this side of her face. This wasn't necessarily a light, but it was establishing more of a light side and a dark side on her face. Obviously, this is basically top lit, as you can see, but we have more shadow on this side of her face. And then in terms of, if you look at the front of the books and everything like that, you can see that the same color temperature is there as well. And this is what we use, is just having house lights above us that match the tone here. It depends on what you want to create in terms of like having it super silhouetted or just focusing on that. But we wanted to highlight that, hey, we're in a bookstore. This is supposed to be natural, also looking commercial and otherworldly. So we had the lights on in the front just to establish that as well. So going into the next shot, we kind of want to keep it consistent. So let me erase all this stuff and then switch back. And we wanted to keep that consistent. So again, we had those Titan tubes up in the row, and then you can kind of see how they're outlined here. We had one here in the back that we had to get rid of, but there is one right above her here. And then this is shooting down. And then you can see that there is a skirt on this because this sign is getting lit up. This side of her head is getting lit up as well. But there is no spill happening on these books, as in like this is all necessarily not lit. and getting a lot of light. If I had that tube up there just without any skirt or anything like that, the light would spill everywhere and we wouldn't necessarily get any shape or anything like that. So a thing could do in terms of, establishing a light and shadow side, you can either, keep it consistent in terms of what you saw before, or you can play up the fact in terms of relighting every scene. What you could have done is had another Titan tube. I'm just going to draw this in blue to make it theoretical and light that side of her face and develop that shadow there and just swap it over. This is just very subjective. Again, really depends on what you're looking for and what you want. If we go back to the golden rules in terms of shooting on shadow side, this is not necessarily a thing that you have to abide from. This is just something that I like to practice. But again, now we're here on light side, but we're dealing with a top lid source. But in some of my work, you can see that I kind of venture on the light side in terms of shooting on it. I'm not shooting on something that completely is flat. If I look here, I have a gradient going across her face. Obviously, this is the lighter side, but I do have some dark parts here, a little bit here, and then on the front side of her shoulders and arms there. And then if we look on the light side, we have some here. So I do get some natural kind of checkerboard and dark and white that we're looking for. Again, this would look a lot better if it was on the other side, but I was playing more here with consistency rather than looking for a perfect cinematic looking image. From that, let's kind of take a look back and see what we're doing in terms of movements and everything like that. So we did this in terms of going through a montage of what they're doing. And then we did a 2-shot of here in terms of the book she finds. She pulls it out. And then what we're matching between these 2 shots is the action. She just pulled that book out of there. And then now we're the perspective of her pulling out something from the grocery store itself. So again, we're later in the edit, so we already have everybody's attention. So now you can kind of keep playing around with like these montage things as well. And again, in this grocery store, we didn't have a lot of light to play with. And you can see those strip lights that I was talking about earlier, and they're scattered all across everything here. So we're playing with the light that is inside the fridge itself, and then we're adding our own lights here. So on the left side of camera, which is the right side of her, we have an F22, which is diffused, and then this is matched to the lights that I saw there. So this is around 5600 Kelvin, which is weird because they're kind of set to daylight inside a grocery store. Grocery stores are usually bright and hairy and stuff like that. So we're matching that. And this is giving the nice lighting that we see here. And I kind of want, now it's like a question is like, ooh, why did I decide to put it on that side instead of the other side? I was kind of looking at this frosted door and how that was affecting the light and everything like that. So I was like, let's just put it on this side and see how it operates in terms of shining it and everything like that. And it worked really well. There's no shadows casted if we, play this back and everything like that because the door was already open. So this was acting as like another layer of diffusion and interest onto her as well and softening everything up. And then if we look at the other side, there was no neg, but we get some shadow developed here. And this is just due to the black nature of the edge of the freezer. And then again, in terms of composition, we're looking at a frame in terms of frame and one of these specialty shots. And this is framed up exactly by the either ice creams as well as the black bars up top, right? And then if we look at in terms of the lights inside, we get nice light and dark parts that we're always looking for in terms of interest. And then in the next scene, we match back to her again in another scenario. So this is her in a flower shop, kind of giving her nice own self-care. So this is the part in the edit where we go back into montage where it's just like we're playing on the music beats and sound design and everything like that and not necessarily looking at actions. We've established that everything is kind of random and that we've established the nice flowiness in the edit beforehand. And now we can get jumpy in terms of where we're going. And then you can, if you play the edit back in terms of how it sounds and everything, you can see why the decisions in terms of us putting things in specific places. So this was just a POV shot to match her action in terms of like, oh, she just pulled that out. And then this is just another advancement in basically both timelines in terms of like, if she pulled the ice cream out, she would have closed the door. So this is her completing that action in terms of pulling those flowers out, having them on her person, and then closing the door as well. This was kind of like, even Jason agreed too, this was one of our favorite shots in terms of how everything looked. There's a wide shot that never made the cut in terms of her looking around the flower shop and too. But this is something that we really liked in terms of how everything looked, and it just looked very poppy. There's a lot of interest in the frame, as well as it was just a really fun shot to do as well. So again, kind of copied the same lighting setup from before. We have an f/22, and this is double diffuse, and this is on her right side, camera left, and this was the same copy as we did before, right? So keeping your lighting consistent is very important as well. And then this is motivated by this daylight coming in here. So we're shooting this around like 3 o'clock, so the sun was blazing down into the room like this, and then you can see that by the harsh cut of shadows and down in that side of the image. So that was playing on it nicely, and we wanted to already add to that what was there. So this f/22 is just another kiss of light, adding it to the 5600 Kelvin to match that daylight. And then on the other side of her is just naturally the shop and everything fell into darkness because there was a lot going on in that side. As you can see, there's a bunch of plants and everything back here. And then that was just adding as its own natural neg because there was a lot of dark greens, browns, and everything like that. So we didn't really have to set up a floppy at all. It was already there in terms of looking at her face and getting that shadow side as well. So if we look here, she's nicely lit on the right side of her face, her camera left. And then if we look on the shadow side, which is the primarily hers going into here, and then just a nice patch of light and dark that we're looking for. So again, nice shot that we agreed on. And then another thing that you have to consider when shooting inside of things like this is your reflections. Well, when we opened the fridge, luckily there was no reflections as the frost was already there. But when you close this, we saw everything that was on the camera. And you can kind of see it right here. It's like a little nucleus cable, but we had to black out everything on the camera in terms of tally lights, even the nucleus motors, the tear deck, and everything like that. So just something to consider if like, oh, you're like, what is that in that? It's probably your camera and the reflections that you're getting off of it. And then now we go into the really fun parts of this commercial in terms of lighting. And when I mean fun, at that, these were extremely annoying. So we go from a POV shot to another POV shot, but we're dollying out, and then we kept it consistent across the board as well. So these were like the main shots that we prioritize in each of the locations, and it's kind of like the same thing that we did here. We're moving through each of these basically different worlds and different lives, and then we're doing it again here. So he's sorting through the records. We're moving through that, just skimming across the edge of that, and then the barista's making the original coffees. Obviously, this is a different mug than what we saw before, and we knew that, but it just looked a lot better because we tried a different bunch of mugs and it just didn't end up working. And then we go out to this pullout of him picking up a cauliflower and then putting into that. So these are the three actions that we're going to be focusing on, and these, again, were the most just annoying and things to light ever. So if you remember back in the first scene when he is going into the record store, this is him walking into here, and then the camera is placed just over those records that you see there. So if we go back to that actual shot here, you can see where we're kind of looking at in terms of our light sources and everything. So we had the daylight spilling in from outside here, and that's like the nice pool of light we got here. And then to keep it consistent in terms of like a soft look, I didn't want to use any harsh sources, even though I needed so much power. And because probe lenses require so much light, because we're shooting at f/14, we had to use a 1200D here. And then because this is a point source light with that Fresnel, you have to diffuse it so much in terms of the amount of power you need, and then also achieving a soft look. So this is actually triple diffused with 2 scrim gems. This scrim gem here has a layer diffusion here and a layer diffusion here. And then this other one has a layer diffusion outside, and this is like a 6x4. And this is like a 4x4, something like that in similar dimensions. We didn't really need anything big. And then this also has like a grid on it, so it kills all the spill too. So again, we're going through 1 + 1 + 1, and this gives us 3 stops of diffusion, right? Spreading that light and making it as soft as possible. And then to add more levels, because this was a little bit too sidey in terms of the lighting, I added kind of an F22 overhead. This is not the exact position, but this was to add more levels to the hands and the records as well. And just to match the daylight we see in the back, this is set to 5600 Kelvin, and this is a 1200D, so it's already set to daylight, and that's 5600 Kelvin. And then these lights were at pretty much full pop when it comes to when it came to actually lighting this space. And then you can see like the F22 gives us that nice soft top light that we're looking for, and then the 1200D is giving us a light across the image, right? And then if we look at the shadow specifically, we have a neg, which is a floppy just tabled over there, sitting up on the records, and this is adding our shadow back into this side of the image, and then a little bit on the other side of things. So when it comes to probe lights, when it comes to probe lenses, you're shooting at, in this case, it was f16. So everything is in focus, but because you're so close to everything and there's so much movement, it kind of doesn't really throw you off in terms of that thing. But you notice that everything's a little bit sharp, right? So this is just how you combat that sharpness in terms of, I like to light things soft and then just really bring that back, that interest that happens when you flatten out an image, when you shoot at that high of a T-stop. And then this is the next image. So this is actually flipped. You have to be careful in terms of when you can flip the things or not, because in terms of if there's a text in the background here, it would be flipped and read backwards and somebody would catch it, obviously. But this is just in terms of you have to decide in terms of you just have to consider that when you shoot something, it's not, oh, I wish that was on the other side. In post, you can change a lot of things in terms of that. I do that a lot in terms of like, this person's running in the wrong direction, or this doesn't feel that good. And so we have to flip things. And then you can actually see now that I'm noticing that there's a reflection here. I don't exactly, this says cappuccino. I don't know what the bottom says at all, but this is reading right. But this is a reflection, so it should be reverse. So this exactly proves my point. And you can see back here, it says espresso, but this is supposed to be actually in the right form. So this is something I'm only picking up now. I didn't even pick it up when I was editing it, but just something to consider. So this was very awkward to actually light because we're in a very tight situation. So I had a lot of lights in play here to make this as interesting as possible. So this is like a very heavy lit scene. And then again, we're going to be playing with that 1200D to give us all that light. And this was triple diffused. So I'm not going to write as much as I did before, but I have that 1200D shooting here. And this is just giving me my main key source and giving me all my ambient levels. And then on top of that, right here, I had an F22. And then this is kind of tabled over off in this direction. And this is adding more wrap to everything and adding more levels. All right. So everything, this is double diffuse. It didn't have the grid on. This is triple diffuse and it had the grid on at the front. All right. Just to kill the spill of all that light coming in. And then even more, we had a Titan tube, which was boomed out just overhead here. And then that was adding more light back into this as well. I know this is very confusing in terms of where the light positions are, but they're all right overhead here. And then this one's off to the side. Because what I found is like we have this light coming in and it's kind of coming behind, but we didn't have enough of a light wrapping around into the machine itself. And then we were dealing with a lot of reflections and everything like that. So this is how I wrapped that light and got enough interest as well here. And then to add more interest into the room, we actually had a Aperture Nova, and this was blasted up into the ceiling. And then we had another tube light, which is in front of this little display of pastries and everything. And this was just adding some levels to that as well. And then we have another light, which is the Nanlite 6dB. This is one of my favorite lights because it just adds that little bit of extra oomph to the picture of what we're looking for. And then this was this streak of light right here. So it's going across the whole frame, and then it's painting the wall here because I noticed that this part of the image was a little dark. So I wanted to bring up that stuff I want to bring up that side of the image in terms of like, this is a little distracting. Let's light it up a bit. So that's exactly what I did. And the reason why we have so many lights is because I was dealing with an area that was super awkward. We're using the peri-probe lens, so we had this at a 90-degree angle, and then I could move backwards going across from it rather than setting up a complicated ring that we had to go through it. So because the lens is in there and we have to light this space, I had to go around so many things in terms of getting light to be in certain places or not like that. And then once that I lit the cup and everything like that, and especially the person's hand, now how did I add interest into the back of the frame? And this was just using so many lights to do that. So we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. We had 6 lights to do this. And this is relatively pretty tight shot, but we just had a big background that we had to work with. And this is just the reality of like commercial lighting and making something feel unworldly, as well as having that F16, having that T-stop of T16 just kills you when you're actually lighting spaces like this. Going into the next shot here, again, just matching that camera movement as we were doing before. This was a little bit easier because we had a lot of ambient light already. This was a grocery store. Grocery stores are bright. And I wanted to play up on the actual lighting sources that already existed there. And then these were these strip lights that were above. Right? So what we had to do is we had to add to that. So the first thing that I did was attach a Titan tube right above this section here. And then this is blasted at 100%. And this is giving me all my light down here. And then we added, this is actually a Titan tube back here. And then there's another one here. And then if I were to draw this out fully, like the seam of the light is right there. And the other seam of the light is here. So you would 100% know that those are Titan tubes and they were just placed back there. But we hid that with the cauliflower. And this was just adding a nice interest. You're like, oh, that makes sense. They would light, the back of the vegetables and everything like that. And it did make sense in terms of what we were doing. And then to add some interest in the back, we had an aperture 600D just blasted up into the ceiling over here. And this was just adding some interest over here as well. And then we had a Nova too. So let me just draw those lights. That was blasting up into the ceiling. And then we had an aperture 600D here. So again, this location allowed us to play on the lights that were already there and add existing interest. A lot of the times when I'm shooting in locations like a grocery store, and again, like we said, we couldn't turn off all the lights, is that you have to add your own lights to add visual interest, which we did with the Titan tubes, and then play up with what you have here. We're playing, again, this is a big composition game. I'm just going to draw in terms of what I'm looking at in terms of composition. We're dealing with a lot of lines that just line up down to the center and what we're playing off with too, right? So this is something that is interesting too in terms of analyzing these camera movements. If we play this frame where our eyes are pretty aligned in terms of obviously the action because it's in your face, but also those lines too. Then if you look at the next frame, we're just moving towards exactly those lines as well. So this just helps those camera movements. Even if I play this across here, those lines just add up to that as well. And then, yeah, just playing between these two shots, you can just see where the focal point is and what we're doing in terms of completing the action. So if I erase all these and then we're just playing in terms of that motion as well. We had to strike all our lights here, but you can see that 600D in the other aisle right there, just playing up and blasting into the ceiling, getting that nice strip of light, as well as more interest into the background here, because we're shooting this as like the sun was already set, and then that's the front of the store, so there wasn't a lot of light coming in from the outdoors. So this is how we basically added that back. Then going into the next shot, this is now like the first 3 shot in the sequence where we see him grabbing this and then moving towards the cart, and then a POV shot of the cart. And you can see, obviously, this is a jump in time, and that this doesn't matter. Obviously, you could shoot this where you see necessarily like the back of the fridge and everything in the background here, but we're just wanting to advance it like, oh, they're somewhere else. We just didn't do like a full like 2-second shot sequence of shots that were in the same place. We wanted to kind of divvy it up and position it in multiple places. So this is courtesy of my rigging grip here, which is key grip, which is Nick. Amazing at putting any camera where I want. But a funny part of this, and people don't realize, is that you can kind of see in this one, there's a bunch of hair in the wheel, and we actually had to take this wheel apart. And this wheel part, clean it, take out all the hair, and put it back in. Obviously, we can't, fix all the rust spots or get all that. But again, this was a quick shot that we didn't really care about. But my rigging grip here used actually the Tilta system, the Tilta Hydra system that we used in one of the car shots to do this, which I found really interesting. I just kind of gave him the camera and said, position where exactly I wanted it, mounted it upside down, and it was the perfect shot that we exactly wanted. Again, we're just playing with movement here and leading lines that kind of lined up the cart. I was kind of walking around with the director, Jason, and we were just lining up in terms of what we're interested in here. So there's a lot of leading lines that direct you right towards this wheel that we're going to be going through. So if we just, play it, scrub it back and forth, you can see that those lines just line up exactly with the action. And like I said, this is kind of where we bounce between like, oh, we're in this grocery store with a nice 3-shot sequence, and then now we're in a karaoke bar. This was, again, playing up with the advancements in all these storylines that we're looking at. And he was obviously, his story was like, oh, he found some records riding his bike, and then he met up with some friends at this karaoke bar. And then the movement that we have is we're just pushing in, and this is kind of random in the sequence and doesn't really play in with a bunch of things. But the way that we brought it back in terms of, making it consistent is we have a push in here, but we move into a POV shot, but then we move into a POV of the mic. So that's how you bring back the consistency in terms of like, oh, that was really random. This is really random too. Oh, this makes sense. So it's, again, feeling the edit, feeling the music, and what makes feel right. Of course, across the board, we can't just have all match cuts and consistency. That would be kind of weirdly to say jarring. But this is not jarring enough because we made it come back in the edit back here when we have that POV shot. So that's just something considered when you're doing these shots like this. And then this was actually a very interesting shot to light because we were dealing with a lot of practicals. As you can see, as we pause it here, what we exactly did with the Titan tubes. And that was our creative director's call in terms of like, hey, can we just put tubes in there, see how it looks like? And it was a fantastic call in terms of how it looked. So let me start off with my key source here. I have an F22, and this is rigged above in the ceiling, and all the wires are hidden and routed up into the ceiling. A fantastic job by my key grip and gaffer. And then this is set to 2700 Kelvin, and this is giving my top light to my talent here. And then we had it biased into the corner of the room, kind of shooting towards this way, and kind of to develop a shadow side. So if I were to kind of, position it, the light would be here, kind of shooting down. So we have the shadow, as you can see on some of our characters' faces on here, which we're going to explore after. And then this is just natural. This is just like the commercial, color palette people go for, which is that orange and teal, or just blue and orange here. They're at opposite sides of the color spectrum, so that's why it works so well. So again, we just have 1, 2, 3, 4 Titan tubes set here, and they're kind of placed back to back. You can see with those seams, and it was just something like yeah, that's fine, makes sense. And they were just sitting there on the shelves. There was lucky like a little nook that we could just put them in, and they were sitting there naturally, and we set them to this like party blue color that we always go for. So this was just adding our color contrast, and then we didn't really have to do anything to add it to that. But obviously, if you just look at this as a still frame, you don't see all the party colors happening in the background. So what we wanted to do is emulate that this was a karaoke bar, or, that there's a big TV playing around in the background with like the music that they're singing to. And you can see that with the color shift that's happening, it's ever so slightly. It goes from purple to like a yellow orange or something to like that. So what we actually did is, if we look at a top-down drawing of the room, this is the L of the room that we're shooting into that gives us the most depth. And then I had my gaffer, I'm just going to color this in another thing, use these magnets that we like to use on our Titan tubes. And one Titan was above here, another was a Titan was above here, and another one was above here. And then in this corner of the room, we had a Nova setup as well. and another tube here. And these were all crated. So they had all those crates that just basically killed the spill of the wall. Actually, these are the exact crates that I'm talking about. As you can see, the light fits right in there. And then if we were looking at it, the tube light fits down there. And then it kills all the spill. So this is what you would commonly see on like a softbox or a big crate of diffusion. And then this just, tightens the beam angle in terms of what you're doing. And then you also can like angle it in terms of more directly light exactly what you want to light. Right, so those were all created because what I wanted to do is not necessarily have the color cast going across the whole room in terms of this big party effect. I wanted it to be very subtle. And I only wanted it to be on the talent. So like the TV is naturally here, so I wanted that to be the direction of the color. And then we just set all those Titan tubes to like a party mode, so it would just cycle very softly, not too anything too aggressive. And then as you can see, it's super subtle. Right. And then just adds the depth of color that we're looking for. So if we pause it here, we can kind of see the shadow that we're developing, what I was talking about before. If we kind of just highlight the light parts and like our key light sources here, you can see that we have sort of Rembrandt line going over here and even here on the top of the face, but super soft off top because the ceilings were high. So we weren't dealing with anything that was super close. But again, this is how you top light something, but also bias the shadow side, as you can see here and here. So if I were to draw this in more detail, this is like the corner of a room, and then this is like the ceiling, and then this is us looking up into that ceiling as well. So you would see more of the light looking up like this, obviously with the grid and everything attached to kill all that spill. But the light is pointed more down towards like kind of scooping out this way. Right, so it's top lit, but it also gives you the shadow side on a specific side. And as we move away from that light, that shadow side is more developed as this pool of light is more in the corner. So this was like a really fun one to light because all of us were having fun when, just like, hey, can we add a set of lights here? Even like the corner of the lights that really added depth to the room as well, and just more interest, as you can see, kind of like this spilling up into here. So it was pushing a lot of blue into the shadow and basically sold this scene a lot more in terms of what was going on, because getting a bunch of talent to sing karaoke well, there is a full film crew behind them looking at them and staring at them and analyzing in terms of light can be pretty intimidating. So this was like a super fun one to light. And then next we get the cheers, and then this goes into her putting the bag in. This was very funny. And then this goes into that. So a big thing when it comes to getting like big movements that, get people excited, like, oh, how did they do that and everything like that, is these specialty shots. And this is something that Tenfold has implemented in our work a lot. And this is, what we're getting known for, and like, how did they get those shots, very quickly and very simply as well. So this was shot on the FX3, and this is on the 20 mil, giving consistency across those specialty shots that we have in terms of these POV shots. And this was a bag that we made out of the paper wrapping that is existent. It's literally us folding those corners of the bag, making those hard edges, our production designer taping on handles. And this looked comically big, obviously, when we were shooting it. But when it came to actually looking at it in camera, we're like, oh, this looks like an actual bag. And you see me pulling the camera back and then her going into the bag, and it's very comical. But what I did is I simply added a Mayfer clamp to the bottom of the cage, and then I attached the flowers to that, and then simply held it and kind of positioned them more so they were being more of the foreground of the frame, and then pulled it down. And then obviously you want to call have the director call action in terms of this spot, like things like this. But it was better for me to like, hey, talk to the talent in terms of, okay, 3, 2, 1, move. Because if the director calls action, we're both going to delay. And it was just us both moving up and then down and getting into a specific moment, and then also running a bunch of variations to get it. So we had a variation where, it came down, landed, she walked out, just so we would have in post. It's not just getting one shot. It's about getting 3 different variations of the one shot, so you have the flexibility of doing it. So in this shot here, we just had that F22 in play, and then this is just lighting this side of her face. And then we actually had, like, you can see like the strip lights there in the back. This is giving a nice backlit to it. So it's just wrapping that light around and playing with that daylight that we had outside before. But in the bag, there's no lights. There's no light on camera. The bag also obviously had a false bottom, so it's not as dark as it would naturally be. So this was adding more ambience. But if it was a bag that had a bottom, obviously we wouldn't be able to do the movement. We'd have to add some light back into the frame itself. So again, like I was saying, that we've already established all these scenes in the viewer's mind, and now we can kind of swap back and forth, and we're like, oh, we're in a karaoke bar. Makes sense. He was traveling somewhere. And now, oh yeah, I remember her getting flowers. All right. And then we're going back to, okay, let's extend this scene out a little bit more. So this was shot with the 12 mil and on the red Komodo. And then I had my key grip kind of take two friction arms and hold the actual microphone. And then we were moving around. And then what we did is we went to each talent and had them sing a bit and then move back. But what we found was the best is getting some movement and like getting an action, like, oh, pass the mic. Oh, that feels a lot better. Right. So that's what we added to that, just to give it some more, So that's why we have that action, not necessarily him before he has the mic. Oh, he's singing with her. So like, oh, they passed it. There's a passage of time, which is nice as well. So just adding movement to specific things in terms of, they look a lot better. There's a lot going on, and like we're focused on him, and then edges of the blur are nice too in terms of the edges of the frame. So that's just something to consider as well. And then we go into the next shot, which was kind of the first, when we go into the next shot, and this was the first shot of the project. I remember this specifically. And then this is where I remembered that I absolutely hate probe lenses. So again, this will be very familiar in terms of how we lit the other ones too. But we had that 1200D, and this was same to like the other setup we had before when I was comparing the quality of light between contrasts and stuff like that in terms of softness and like the highlights on her face. But this was, again, triple diffused. So I'll just add, there's 2 stops on this plus this one. So we had 3 stops there. And then again, we have those nice strip lights in the background. And then we had to add the F22 kind of tabled over top here. And this was just adding more levels. So this was double diffused with no grid. And then this is all set to 5600 Kelvin. Again, we were using the Periprobe lens for this, but this we kind of learned as the days go in terms of, I was talking my key grip in terms of how we shot this one specifically with the dolly. We had like a dolly extension to come out, but we found it super flimsy and we didn't have a lot of the pieces that we needed. And then when we got to the bookstore, realized I'm like, oh, we can have the camera pointing straight down, and then the Periprobe lens works as it looks like a little periscope actually. And it was really interesting in terms of how you can use it in these unique scenarios, because we would just have to set up all the dolly overhead. We wouldn't have to T-bar anything out or anything like that. And we could hide the stands with our talent specifically. Right. So this is something we learned as we were going in terms of like, oh, this makes more sense in terms of getting the shot, in terms of also quickness and speed and everything like that. We're using the probe lens how it's traditionally supposed to be done in terms of like coming out. So just something to consider when looking at and also testing your camera and lenses as well. And then again, like I said before, we had that little blue light, which is a little MC shooting up here at a really low percentage, just to add a little bit more contrast into the image as well. And then we had floppies set up on this side of the image. So you got a little dark parts there. And then you can kind of see that F22 with the top light coming down. And because we have some shadow on the like corners of it, but the main shadow is coming onto the actual table and casting down there, and it's not really sidey. But if we look at like this nail polish thing, we have a little bit of shadow here, which is not filled in as much. So this was just, the setup when it came to doing these probe shots. 1200 triple diffuse, the 1200 triple diffuse, giving me my main key source and everything in between. And then the F22 was just like a slight, even at 100%, was just a slight upgrade in terms of the level of light that we had. So very annoying to light, but also fun as well as a great challenge terms of just knowing your light sources and how to use them. Next, we are going into this continuation of the bike shots. So here in the background, as the shots that we were looking at before, you could see that my camera movement was back here. And if we look at the sun position, again, it's like overhead, super coming down like right here. So this was not necessarily focusing on the lighting and everything like that, but more so the camera moves, because we're technically, breaking the 180 degree rule here. But because these shots are so separated, it doesn't even matter, right? So coming up and then pushing into the next shot here. So this is just purely camera movement. So we're just going to get rid of these lines here and only look at the camera movement. So these are the last two shots in the piece itself. And in the edit, we knew that this was going to be our last scene, and this is going to be where the title card lands. So it's just like, how do we get out of certain things and into this specifically? So in this here, we're like, oh, she just got her nails done and she's going home, but we need something to transition her going home without being too jumpy. And we did this with the matching camera movement. So I'm pushing in as he's coming towards me. And then the main thing is that I'm continuing to push in as he passed me and tilt up. And then we kind of complete that movement with the final building here. That is the ivy specifically. So this is just getting your camera movements dialed in terms of all the scenes across the board. We knew that we needed to get multiple coverage for this, but we didn't know necessarily where it would sit in the edit. If we play the beginning of the edit, and if you look at all the wide shots in this piece, I'm constantly pushing in and tilting up. So this just sets the precedent as well as how the progression of the edit will look. Even if we consider these first shots again, I'm tilting in, pushing up, but I'm not fully tilted up here. Again, kind of pushing in, tilting up a bit. And then here I'm fully in, tilting up, and we're in like his perspective. We're in his action itself. So the actions progress across the board too. And then when we go to the end here, it's kind of the same thing. So it's just like looking at your movements and considering them all the time in terms of that. So what I like to do is whenever I plan a shot list or anything like that, especially with directors I like to work with all the time, is like, hey, even though I know that you're only considering one action here and you kind of only want 2 shots, can we add maybe 3 shots, not necessarily adding all to the setup time, but can we push back and can we pull back and get a wide shot of this of me pushing in? This could be handheld or anything like that. Just to add the variety, I'm like, oh, this feels really stale when we get to the edit. How can we add that? And how can we, travel across each of the scenes that we're going through? This is very specific for montage commercials because I shoot these all the time, is that I'm always looking for camera movement and fluidity across my scenes. I'm not really looking at the edit, though. Luckily, luckily I have an editor's mind. So I'm like, oh, I know that will work. And then sometimes I learn a lot of things. I'm like, oh, that wouldn't work at all. So it's having the edit in mind. I know a lot of cinematographers aren't editors, and it's good to, get into cross-disciplinary things when you're thinking about the edit, because it makes you a better cinematographer. It makes you a better director of photography, especially when it comes to camera movements and like that. And it even makes you a better director when you're considering the edit and everything like that too. So just something to consider when you're shot listing your next project or something similar to this, where you have this montage of multiple scenes, is kind of program the same camera movements across the board, and also have some consistency and specialized camera movements across the board as well. Like, hey, this in this specific edit, the fridge scenes worked really well. And then in across the board, when we're looking at like the tabletop scenes going across the tables, worked really well. And then in one of the scenarios, we actually had 2 of those that were lined up that were working for recuts and everything like that. So it's just big planning. Just put big energy into planning, especially when it comes to camera movements and adding fluidity back into your piece itself.